Most people believe that when someone suddenly ignores them, it means something simple. Maybe that person is busy. Maybe they are distracted. Maybe the connection just faded naturally. But in the hidden psychology of human relationships, sudden silence rarely happens without a reason. In fact, one of the most disturbing dynamics in social interaction is not open conflict. It is unexplained withdrawal. A person who once spoke to you every day suddenly becomes distant. Messages become shorter. Replies arrive hours later. Eventually, they disappear altogether. And the most unsettling part is not the distance itself. It is the absence of explanation. Carl Jung believed that what disturbs us most in others often reveals something unresolved within ourselves. And few things disturb the human mind more than silence without clarity. Because when someone suddenly ignores you, your psyche begins searching for answers. Did I say something wrong? Did I offend them? Did I lose their respect? The mind becomes an investigator, replaying past conversations, analyzing tone, interpreting every small detail. But the deeper truth is that this reaction has less to do with the other person and more to do with how the human psyche responds to uncertainty. The brain is wired to resolve ambiguity. When something important becomes unclear, the mind begins filling the gaps with stories. And most of the time, those stories turn against us. We imagine rejection, we imagine disapproval, we imagine loss of value. But here lies the psychological paradox. The person who ignores you may not be thinking about you nearly as much as you think. In many cases, the sudden silence is not about you at all. It is about power. In social dynamics, attention is a form of currency. The one who gives attention appears engaged. The one who withdraws attention creates distance. And distance changes the balance of psychological control. When someone suddenly ignores you, they introduce uncertainty into the relationship. And uncertainty is one of the strongest forces in human behavior. It pulls attention, it provokes curiosity, destabilizes emotional equilibrium. This is why the sudden absence of someone who was once present can feel so powerful. But Carl Jung observed something essential about these situations. Human beings constantly project meaning onto others. We do not see people as they are. We see them through the lens of our expectations, fears, and unconscious needs. When someone stops responding, the projections intensify. The mind creates explanations where none exist. Sometimes the person who withdraws is simply losing interest. Sometimes they are overwhelmed by their own life. But in other cases, the silence is strategic, a subtle psychological maneuver designed to regain control of the emotional dynamic. Manipulative personalities often use silence as a tool, not loud, aggressive manipulation, but quiet manipulation. They understand that when they withdraw attention, the other person begins chasing clarity. The roles reverse. The one who once felt secure becomes anxious. The one who withdrew becomes psychologically dominant. This dynamic appears frequently in relationships where boundaries are unclear. When someone learns that your emotional stability depends on their attention, they unconsciously gain influence over your behavior. They can create tension simply by pulling away. And many people fall into the trap immediately. Send another message. They apologize for something they don't understand. They attempt to restore the connection by explaining themselves. But this reaction often reinforces the very dynamic that created the problem. Because when silence provokes desperation, it confirms that attention equals power. Jung believed that individuation requires something most people struggle with deeply: the ability to remain psychologically centered even when others withdraw approval or presence. In other words, the ability to tolerate uncertainty without collapsing into self-doubt. When someone suddenly ignores you, there are two possible psychological responses. The first is reaction. You chase clarity. You seek explanations. You attempt to repair the perceived rupture. The second response is observation. Instead of reacting immediately, you step back and observe the pattern. Has this person used silence before? Do they disappear whenever conflict appears? Do they return once you show emotional vulnerability? Patterns reveal far more than explanations ever could, because behavior, unlike words, rarely lies. The truth is that people reveal their psychology most clearly when they stop performing. When attention disappears, so does the social mask. Some people vanish because they avoid confrontation. Others vanish because they seek control. And some vanish because the connection was never as deep as it seemed. But regardless of the reason, the moment someone suddenly ignores you presents a psychological test, not of your worth, but of your internal stability. Can you tolerate silence without immediately questioning your value? Can you remain centered even when clarity is absent? Most people cannot. They were conditioned to interpret distance as rejection, and rejection triggers a primal fear embedded deep in human evolution. For our ancestors, exclusion from the group meant danger. The modern mind still carries this ancient reflex. When someone withdraws, the nervous system reacts as if belonging itself is under threat. But individuation, as Jung described it, requires breaking this reflex. It requires recognizing that your value cannot depend on the consistency of someone else's attention. Because attention is unstable. People give it freely when they are comfortable and withdraw it when they feel uncertain. If your sense of self moves with their attention, you will never feel grounded. But something interesting happens when you stop reacting to unexplained silence. The emotional dynamic begins to shift. The person who withdrew may suddenly return, not necessarily out of affection, but out of curiosity. Because silence that does not produce reaction disrupts the expected pattern. If someone withdraws attention, expecting you to chase it, and you do not, the psychological script collapses. Now the uncertainty moves in the opposite direction. They begin wondering what changed in you. But the deeper transformation does not occur in the relationship. It occurs within you. When you stop interpreting every silence as rejection, you begin reclaiming psychological independence. You recognize that other people's behavior often reflects their internal state more than your value. Some individuals are simply incapable of consistent connection. Others seek control through emotional distance. And some are navigating struggles you cannot see. But none of those explanations require you to abandon your own equilibrium. Silence in itself is neutral. It becomes painful only when we attach our identity to someone else's response. Jung warned that projecting our worth onto external relationships is one of the most common psychological traps of modern life. When we believe our value depends on being understood, appreciated, or consistently acknowledged, we hand over our internal authority. But when you withdraw that projection, something shifts. You stop interpreting every silence as a verdict on your worth. You begin seeing it as information. Information about the other person's emotional capacity, information about the stability of the relationship, information about whether the connection was built on mutual presence or emotional dependency. And this clarity transforms the way you respond. Instead of chasing explanations, you begin observing patterns. Instead of filling silence with anxiety, you fill it with awareness. Because the moment you stop needing constant validation, unexplained silence loses its power over you. And this is where the real psychological shift begins. The person who once felt destabilized by distance becomes someone who can stand calmly within it. Not cold, not indifferent, but centered. The paradox is that when you reach this point, people begin relating to you differently. Because individuals who cannot be easily destabilized by silence project a subtle form of authority. They do not demand attention. They do not chase approval. They simply remain grounded in their own psychological center. And in a world where many relationships operate through emotional reactions, this kind of stability becomes rare. Suddenly, the silence that once disturbed you becomes a filter. It reveals who communicates openly and who disappears when discomfort arises. It reveals who values connection and who values control. And most importantly, it reveals how much of your identity once depended on the responses of others. Carl Jung believed that the path to individuation requires confronting these moments directly. Moments where the psyche is tempted to seek reassurance outside itself. But instead of chasing external clarity, you turn inward and ask a different question. What does this situation reveal about me? Because the true measure of psychological maturity is not how others treat you when everything is comfortable. It is how you remain centered when uncertainty appears. When someone suddenly ignores you, the event may feel personal, but often it is simply a mirror. A moment that reveals whether your sense of self is anchored internally or externally. And the moment you realize that silence cannot diminish your worth, something powerful happens. The dynamic changes. You stop reacting. You start observing. And the energy that once went into chasing explanations returns to where it always belonged. yourself. Stay sharp.